All right, we'll just carry on with some of the aspects or themes of the creative revolution, and in part looking at how some of these carry on well past the 1960s and their importance, I think, for animating or informing contemporary advertising in the last couple decades or so. So, I mean, we saw the aspect of humor. Now, humor didn't start in the 1960s, but you start to see it more and more often in advertising. That you didn't have to have a serious posture around a product. You could actually be funny about it. And sometimes even you can lightly make fun of the product in ways that would help you connect with consumers. So humor is not new to the 60s, but you see an acceleration of it. And certainly today, a lot of advertising uses humor far more so than you would have seen in the 40s or 50s. Irony. And this is something that is mostly new to the 1960s. And you will see irony used in increasing ways in the decades afterwards as well. And we'll come back to that in a second. The second point is a kind of rebel talk where sometimes products are endowed with a kind of rebel posturing, a sense of the kind of rebel self, you being the individual opposed to the mainstream and that sort of thing. But sometimes this rebel kind of rhetoric of rebellion can even take the form of even being sort of anti-consumerist, anti-materialist, somebody who wants to sort of set themselves even outside the realm of consumption. And in fact, you can validate that position in part through certain types of consumption, certain types of products that will work to reinforce that message. And third, a kind of youth talk. And by this, I don't mean just sort of appealing to young people, say people under 30 or something like that. It's more a kind of notion of youth as an attitude, and one that represents a break with tradition and even a break with conformity or fitting into certain aspects of society. So, you're breaking with these older patterns, you're symbolizing a new kind of attitude. And so youth talk isn't really just about young people, it's about this new kind of expression of what's new and exciting along those lines. You'll start to see this again coming out of these are ideas that Thomas Frank presents in the article for today, and he does it in more detail throughout his book. And you start to see examples of marketers even speaking flippantly or even somewhat kind of mockingly about the products that they're promoting in ways they're not taking them too heavy. In other words, right? They're sometimes very light in terms of the way that they appeal or discuss those products. So this kind of flippant appeal, again, it's a characteristic of our sensibilities, I would say, more so in our society in the last 20 or 30 years. And that's in part informed by a type of hip consumerism advertising. You're also seeing a lot of sort of a mocking of mainstream consumer culture, the broad kind of mass society. This is, again, it's a type of advertising that starts in the Creative Revolution that in many respects is the culmination of that long-standing mass society critique that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks or so. And you will see more and more that advertising after the 1960s and beyond is not so much at all about fitting us into this, whatever social groups we think we need to belong to in the context of a mass society. It's about demarcating us. It's about identifying us and appealing to us as individuals, as a kind of an original self in that sense. The other theme would involve themes of kind of escaping, rebellion, kind of getting beyond the conventions of the time. Now, in some cases in the 60s and 70s, they would actually incorporate countercultural imagery. So this is part of from the youth counterculture. There's an example of that from the 1970s there. In this case, the African-American counterculture that developed in the 1970s especially. And you'll see that in those two decades, the 60s and 70s, less so today, I would argue. Now, the interesting thing that Frank presents is that hip consumerism can even uh, provide an outlet or a vehicle for a type of consumption that can relate to or corresponds to a kind of discontent for consumerism as a whole. So we'll look at a couple of those a bit later, but so essentially you can imagine that in society there may be certain things you don't like about consumption, whether the environmental aspect, whether it's the pollution, whether you think it just makes people kind of materialist in terms of their orientation, that their values get warped by consumerism. And in fact, the way that some might respond to that is to kind of opt out or to channel their kind of sensibilities into other directions. But in fact, what Frank argues is that new types of products, new types of marketing can actually come in to allow people to express their discontent through consumption, through purchasing. And it's a feature of what he would refer to as the kind of the dynamism of capitalism, in the sense that, scholars have argued that capitalism is very kind of malleable and dynamic. It can adapt to different conditions. I mean, it may seem like during the Great Depression that some thought that capitalism would be effectively defeated, that some form of a modified social democratic system of producing goods in society would take shape. And there have been various times over the years when some thought that capitalism, as we know it, at least in the West, was going to be seriously challenged. But it's been very adaptive and in terms of preserving itself. And one of the ways you can understand that in terms of the realm of marketing and advertising is just looking at how the options are presented for you to consume in ways that might be seen as socially beneficial or sometimes even environmentally beneficial. And in many respects, though, it's still a form of consumption, and it might actually be a type of consumption that you don't really need to do. So, for example, if you were to think of the example we had with the Beetle, the Volkswagen Beetle, as a car that one could embrace if you were tired of car culture or tired of the kind of over-the-top aspects of car culture, or just even later maybe environmentally you weren't so keen on what cars represent in society. Now, the way to express that opposition could be that you get involved in social activism. It could be that you buy a bicycle instead of a car. It could be that you take public transit, etc., etc. The fact that consumerism, at least hip consumerism, allows you to express that opposition through a purchase, through the Volkswagen Beetle in this case, points to the way that you can neutralize those forms of opposition that I just said, opposition that's rooted in social or political activism. And then the other thing to consider is the kind of preemptive irony of all of this. It just relates to that point that you can anticipate forms of opposition and you can preempt that with a kind of ironic embrace of certain forms of consumption as being forms of consumption that actually allow you to identify yourself as someone who's not happy with certain forms of consumption, right? Think of that as preemptive irony in terms of the positioning that you take as a marketer in that respect. And it's part and parcel of this larger idea that capitalism can be very dynamic, right? It can actually absorb the critique within the realm of marketing and advertising itself and provide outlets for people to express themselves through those channels. So here's an ad. I think it's somewhat illustrative of a more recent hip consumerism ad from about 10 years ago. Here's fairly straightforward. You've got the dominant picture here, of course, is not the vehicle. It's this this fellow. What does he look like? He's got a mustache. Looks like it's not a very well-kept mustache. He's got a very bad haircut. He's got an undershirt showing through his outer shirt. He's wearing transition glasses. Again, he seems to embody a kind of negative stereotype of the minivan owner, say from living in the suburbs or the exurbs of whatever city. Now, it's an interesting kind of ad. This is an ad for the Ford S-Max, which is a minivan. But what this ad does is it sort of takes that negative stereotype that people were developing about minivan people, owners, that they were bland, that they were out of step, that they were not cool, that they, were these sort of boring parents living in suburbs. It takes that negative stereotype and it actually works with it, right? So what the ad actually says is that the Ford S-Max, the new sporty minivan with 240 horsepower, right? So every other minivan is this guy, right? The kind of Loserville guy you see right here. But the way that the Ford S-Max is the opposition one. It sets you apart from the minivan crowd. So this is a sort of way of saying you can still be part of the minivan buying public, only you better make sure it's a Ford S-Max or else you're going to look like that guy. Here's a fairly straightforward ad that basically, again, it's sort of mocking the conventions of advertising. It's sort of mocking the fact that advertising is about manipulation and persuasion. And what this one basically says is, hey, reader, we know you're savvy to advertising. We know you know what advertising is all about. So we're going to put an ad up here for this product, Simple Shoes, that basically is just going to have fun with that. And as you can see, it just basically, it's pretty straightforward in terms of what it does, right? So that's, again, it's an example of the kind of mocking the conventions of advertising, even mocking the way that advertising is supposed, the role that it's supposed to play in terms of instilling demand or desire on the part of consumer goods. If you want to show your opposition to that, right, you don't have to sort of opt out of consumption. You can buy Simple Shoes. Now, these, so one of the themes we've been talking about in the course is this earlier period where we looked at the way advertising was about helping you become part of a we, right? A part of a group. So fitting in socially into a segment of society or whatever the case may be. And I've got a couple Bailey's ads. They're from about 10 or 15 years apart. And you can see the one on the left in some ways reflects that. Bailey's brings you closer, right? And it's a group of friends sitting around enjoying themselves, having a good time. They're drinking Bailey's. It's all about the sense that you look at this here is that Bailey's is something that'll help you connect with people, right? It'll help you connect with this group, your friendship circle, or whatever the case may be. It's a part of we building. The one on the right, again, same product, about 15 years later, so not that much later, but it embodies a very different direction in terms of the meaning in the ad, right? Because you're an original, and note the use of the colored lettering for original. So even the word original has multicolors in it, right, to convey an even stronger sense of originality in that sense. Again, this is for Bailey's, but it's obviously not an ad saying this is a product that's going to have you having fun with your friends or build up your social network or something like that. This is an ad that appeals to you for your particularity, right? Your singular nature, your originality. It's trying to speak to you as an individual person and exalting that very notion, right? So it's this idea about we to me in terms of a general trend in advertising. And I think the Creative Revolution in part accelerates that in terms of focusing on individuals and the originality aspect of that. So here's an ad. I don't know if you see this one much anymore. It certainly was pretty popular about a decade or so. And it's the classic, by now it's sort of a classic ad. The PC guy on the left, he's of course your boring businessman. He's staid, he's kind of drab looking. He doesn't look like he's going to be very fun. He also seems like a cookie cutter kind of guy. Like you could almost sort of see a bunch of him in some kind of 1940s office building somewhere. That's the PC guy, right? Part of that sort of bland mainstream. And then you've got Mac guy on the right. And this is supposed to be you, because Mac in those days was appealing to you in terms of a kind of focus on the originality of the product, the way that it speaks to you directly, that you connect with it. It's almost like an extension of yourself. It's not a product that was advertised in terms of having you fit in with a larger kind of social group or something like that. So that's the Mac guy. And you can see here, this is an ad that actually sort of played on that or riffed on that in terms of even sometimes, I'd say it was mocking those original PC and Mac guy ads because they were fairly common or something like that. This one adds an even stronger element of originality in terms of the gender difference, obviously, but also in terms of the way she looks, the more stylized, the more distinctive kind of clothing that she's wearing, to make the Viao an even more sort of original or independence-minded type of brand. Now, I want to just kind of close with a couple of slides here, and I think it points to the paradox of trying to define your individuality through consumption, just to sort of highlight how you are this sort of unique character, and that certain types of purchasing products will help you do that. And so the slide on the left you can see is an example of a bunch of people with their MacBooks out, their Apple computers. Now, when Apple first started marketing these types of products in the 80s, and we'll look at that later in this course, the idea was that this was going to be a product that would set you apart from the IBM type of PC, okay? That a Mac product was something that was distinctive, it was going to bring out your creativity, it was going to be a reflection of who you were as a unique individual. And that, in some level, is true, right? In terms of the way the marketing works. What's fascinating about it, and I usually do this every year in class, I just, have people look around and count the number of non-Macs in the class, and it's usually, less than 10% or something like that. So, at some level, everyone here is sort of has a measure of individual distinction that's linked to their understanding of that computer. It can be a very personalized thing in terms of what you do with it, right? You can obviously make it look unique, and you do see that sometimes with stickers and other things, where they'll take a mass-produced product like a MacBook or something, and they'll try and make it distinctive. But for the most part, this is a kind of mass society thing now for people, especially for people under 40, in terms of their use of Apple products like this. All right. So again, it's not always an obvious thing that you can somehow carve out a sense of individualism through the purchasing that you do. At some point, it kind of catches up with you, and other people kind of catch up with you. And that point is conveyed in the really interesting thing that happened last year. And I'm just going to tell you this story. So there was a study done by some social scientists, and it was published in a kind of journal called the MIT Technology Review. And the study basically argued that nonconformists, so people are trying to nonconform, they tend to act unconventionally in the same way, so that people kind of, when they're trying to sort of be their own unique self, depending on what the circumstances are, they often end up looking like a bunch of other people who are trying to do the same thing, to try and be non-mainstream or nonconformist. And so this was the photo, not with the Twitter thing there, but this photo appeared in the article when it was published. And a guy contacted the publication, and he said, "Hey, I'm really upset that you took my photo and used it for this cover photo for this story, and you didn't get my permission for it." And in the email, which you can see actually if you go and click on that link, he was quite indignant about it. He said it was an example of clickbait, and that it was unethical, that he wasn't consulted about that, and it was disparaging of so-called hip consumers and the way that they were presented, etc. Now, the studies, the people that wrote the article then thought, oh my God, we better check into this, right? I mean, did we actually use a photo of somebody we didn't have permission to use that photo? So they checked with the photo company, Getty Photos, because it was a stock photo. And lo and behold, they found out, they got the permission form, and they found out that the person in the photo who was actually photographed was not the person who complained. All right? And so they contacted the person who complained and said, hey, buddy, it's not you actually in the photo, it's somebody else. And then he wrote back and said, wow, I guess I stand corrected. I thought it was a mildly photoshopped picture of me. I even have a very similar hat and shirt like that. So that led the study's author to tweet out, which you see here, tweets out and he says that the incident just proves the story we ran. Hipsters look so much alike that they can't even tell themselves apart from each other. And I just think that's a wonderful example of this idea of hip consumerism, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a hipster to be part of this larger idea of hip consumerism. But this is an example of hipsters who are setting up a kind of cultural aesthetic for themselves, trying to sort of get themselves outside of the mainstream norms, etc. And by doing that, they end up converging to a point where they end up sort of adopting a new form of conformist behavior and new forms of conformist consumption, perhaps, to the point where they can't even recognize themselves as this guy. He actually thought it was him in the picture because he has the same kind of beard, the same kind of hat, and the same kind of flannel shirt like that. All right? Okay, so that's great. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Take care.